You can take your seats. Thank you very much once again. I'm Rashad Kasaba, the director of the Jackson School. I think we've had a very good first panel, an engaging discussion, and it's a very good segue to what we'll be talking about now. One of the themes that came up in the morning was the gap that exists between academia in general, but more theoretically based, discipline-based social sciences, and the policy world and the needs that exist out there. We have a very good panel that actually bridges this gap in more than one way. Their biographies are listed in your program. They all have very exceptional, stellar careers, and I couldn't do justice here if I tried to read it all. So I will refer you to the program for their biographies, and we will make one small change in that the order of presentations will change. The second and third will switch. And that makes sense for the whole flow of the program. Our first speaker is Anand Yang. Anand is currently a professor of international studies and professor of history at the University of Washington and a previous director of the Jackson School. Anand, in all his career, has been very deeply involved in area and international studies, and he's been very actively engaged with various institutions in Washington, D.C. And our overall theme today is bridging this gap, but specifically foreign language instruction. And just some of you already know, this is a complicated issue because area studies usually is linked with teaching of foreign languages. And very recently, we at the University of Washington has a very long history of teaching a lot of foreign languages. But one of our humanities deans told me that one of the questions that he's trying to find an answer to is to find out actually how many languages we teach at the University of Washington. And that has turned out to be a job that is a lot more difficult than it sounds, and we're still counting. And this is, among other things, it's a question of investment. It's a question of which languages and why, and who determines what are the important languages. And when you go beyond the generally well-known popular languages, then the question of investment becomes very hard to justify sometimes in terms of numbers. But then languages like Pashtun becomes already very important all of a sudden for foreign policy and security issues. So this is a very complicated issue that has many dimensions, so we will address some of those with our presenters. I'm going to turn to Anand first, and he will give us his perspective, coming primarily from academia, but as I said, someone who's been very deeply involved in funding of foreign area and language studies in the various positions that he's had.
Thank you, Rashad. There's no Title VI paradox in the way that there's an aid paradox and the debates about that. Rather, a very small amount of federal funding has led to the institutionalization of area and international studies across the land. And if there's any kind of paradox, it's really more of a puzzle, and that's kind of reflected in the title of my presentation. The puzzle is why this small sum of money that comes from the U.S. Department of Education is always in jeopardy. The title is both literal and metaphorical. Literal in the sense of the future of funding. This Title VI funding is open to question. The last few years have not been kind to Title VI and to Title VI institutions. And I'm also playing on the word of the future imperfect as in future imperfect tense that exists. And so if one could make a verb out of Title VI, this sort of ongoing, uncompleted action of title that if we could transform Title VI into a verb, that's the issue we're facing. As you can see in this next slide, it shows you both the actual dollars as well as dollars translated into fiscal year 2013 dollars. And you can see the steady increase in Title VI funding, but there have been certain dips. As anybody who knows the history of Title VI knows, that there was that moment during President Nixon's term when Title VI almost came to a crashing halt, but fortunately was rescued, and that the worst time for Title VI really has been in the last year or two, when there's been a 40%, over 40% decline in Title VI. What I want to emphasize in this talk is the extent to which Title VI, but not just Title VI, has really institutionalized area and international studies. And in order to understand that, I think you have to understand that contrary to many of the critiques of Title VI, it's not that all of a sudden money appeared in the late 1950s and completely transformed institutions of higher learning. Rather, that money came into universities that were already engaged in area and international studies in one way or another. So let me sort of provide the context here and then move to what the picture is today. So there was a whole pre-World War II history to the kinds of programs Title VI supported, and one can use the example of any number of universities and see this prior history. So in the case of the Jackson School, whose beginnings date back to 1909, starting then we already started thinking about ways to develop University of Washington's Asian studies, Japan, China, and India in particular, especially Japan and China, because Seattle in 1909, which was the date of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, thought of the city and the region as not only connected to, the slogan actually of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition was Seattle Gateway to Alaska and to Asia. So this isn't quite a presidential candidate saying you can see Russia from, but this is that kind of idea. And this meant the starting with languages. So the first move was to develop languages, but also content classes. And then what really gives sort of, creates the concept of Title VI to some extent is the World War II experience of training Army and Navy personnel to know about all the parts of the world. So there's a prior history prior to the post-Sputnik phase that leads to Title VI that's important to bear in mind. Each of these steps is crucial, and this is why Title VI is so important, because it comes to institutions that are already involved in the business of area and international studies and have long histories of it. But what Title VI does is, with the very small amount of money it gives, is it transforms the institutional milieu. I think that's important to keep in mind. And the model that Title VI is picking up, whether consciously or unconsciously, is the Army Specialized Training Programs in Area and Language Studies, which at one point had 150,000 officers on various campuses learning the key languages that soldiers needed to know for the various theaters of war, and the Navy started a similar program. And then, as we all know, the history of Title VI starts out with the mission of training foreign language and area experts. Later, other components are added. And what is developed really is a partnership, a government higher education partnership, which, unlike any other country of the world, makes universities the venues for study of area and international studies. The American model is unique. It is this unique model that is emulated to some extent in Europe. And at a time when area and international studies is under attack from certain disciplinary quarters and from certain people in academia, it is a model that is being picked up and adopted wholesale all across Asia. Just go to Singapore and you can see the extent to which the American model of area and international studies is being infused with a huge amount of funding. And so the consequences of this very small sum of money is huge because it's money that forces universities, I'm tempted to use the word fiscal stimulus, although that's, I think, has a different kind of connotation, but it's kind of it is sort of a financial stimulus that encourages and because of faculty pressure, compels university to organize themselves in a certain way, which means that area and international studies makes its home and finds shelter and builds within the institutional shelter of a university. And I think that's very unique. And other organizations come in both before Title VI and after Title VI, but one by one, all the large funding agencies in many ways withdraw from area and international studies. And nothing epitomizes this more distinctly than the two kinds of initiatives where there has been money given to area and international studies, but the Ford one with the idea of revitalizing, as if area and international studies was in decline, and the second, the bridge funding that was announced by Mellon Foundation in 2012, with the very clear idea that it was going to be a bridge to a different kind of future because of the status of area and international studies. And Mellon is very clear that it does not want to get into the business of replacing Title VI, simply because Title VI is annual sort of grants to universities that encourages and compels universities to behave in a certain way. All the other funding sources, such as what the Jackson School and UW gets from foreign country-based foundations, don't have that mission of Title VI, because Title VI is about all of area in international studies. It's about disciplines, it's interdisciplinary, it's about themes and topics, and it's about creating public intellectuals. All the kinds of themes that came up in the first panel. And so you can see the kinds of foreign sources that exist, whether they're from Japan, whether they're from Korea, whether it's the Jianqing Kuo Foundation from Taiwan, or whether it's other ways that foreign governments and foreign ministries give to American institutions. They don't have that same mission of creating institutional structures that have really been enduring. And then many of the acts of philanthropy that have come from various individuals, whether based in the United States or abroad, all have very specific purposes, all have very specific targets. There is no other body that gives money the way Title VI gives money to create certain kinds of structures within universities. So very quickly, you can see what Title VI does today. 127 institutions. These institutions have produced over 2,000 PhDs. In any given year, 6,000 graduate or professional master's degrees. Some of them have FLAS grants. And over its 50-year-long history, it's produced, the NRCs have produced 100,000 PhDs and 300,000 MAs. And of these 400,000 graduate students, 92% are in disciplines or professions. Only 8%, largely at the MA level, have really been interdisciplinary. So other than schools of international affairs that have these interdisciplinary degrees, most people that have benefited from NRCs and the grants that go with it, the graduate stipends that go with it, the FLASs, really have gotten their degrees from disciplinary programs. And then you can see, and this sort of ties right in with the next presentation, that it's the NRC institutions that have received has provided much of the training for foreign area officers. In fact, the majority of FAOs really go to these kinds of institutions. And NRC institutions are the main source, the main place where you go to study lictals. Again, lictals, less commonly taught languages, that would not be taught were it not for Title VI funding. Part of the inventory that we're doing is really in response to a question that was posed by Provost seemed to come off badly in this session, was really asking, why are we teaching all these languages? Why do we have all these languages that have only 6 or 10 or 8? And of course, as we all know, those kinds of questions were asked at one time at University of Pennsylvania, one of the few institutions that taught Pashto at one time prior to the late 1990s. Again, I don't have the time, but just to give you a sense of some of the important issues to bear in mind, the kind of infrastructure effect that Title VI has, the seeding effect that Title VI has, and this all comes from a conference I participated at Ohio State University, which was really about the impact of NRCs, where a large number of NRC institutions sent representatives to talk about Title VI funding. It clearly has a multiplier effect. We all use Title VI as a way to leverage new positions, to create new programs. And so, for instance, it's not surprising that the Arctic Studies minor is coming out of a Title VI supported Canada Studies NRC, one of the two. Some of you may be surprised that there is NRCs, 2 Canada NRCs in the country. But the Arctic Studies minors really come out of it. And the whole global diversity effect, because the powerful effect that Title VI has in preparing not only people on campus, but beyond the campus, because part of the mission of Title VI, of course, is outreach to K through 12. And the OSU meeting ended with a series of recommendations to US Congress, restoring NRC and FLAS levels to the 2010-11 level. But whether or not this is likely to happen doesn't seem very likely right now. The new normal is that minus 40% from the funding. And the spin-offs and consequences of NRCs have been huge. And you could think about both the kind of interdisciplinarity it's bred on campuses to the vast library collections in foreign areas that we all have, which we have to have in order to be competitive in Title VI. And any of us who come from foreign countries and have made this country our land, we're always surprised that US libraries, university libraries, have many, many more books on all the parts of the world that we come from. That really scholars come from every part of the globe to the United States to work in the libraries on their countries, because of course their countries don't have the collections that we do here. And so it's very much a success story just because of the way it's institutionalized area in international studies. So the question really before us is, were Title VI to disappear, what kind of funding agencies are out there that are likely to participate in what is not a huge financial undertaking, but it is a huge undertaking in the sense that it's an annual grant to institutions across the country. So I can't see any foundation, certainly none that I know of, that's willing to step up to do what Title VI has done. Whoops. And obviously, in terms of area, themes, and problems, Jackson School faculty are on the same page. So even though Sadia Pekkanen and I work on different areas, come from different disciplines, and are interested in different problems, we think of similar ways to respond to the importance of area and international studies. And as the study, which is coming out in International Studies Quarterly in December 2014, points out, where do policymakers go if they really want to get real-world understanding of issues that they're grappling with? Well, the best sources are area and international studies experts. So Title VI is a huge success story. It's a bit of a puzzle, it's a bit of a paradox, why that funding, why we can't sustain that funding, and why a little over $100 million, a tiny fraction of even the US Department of Education funding, is something we can't count on for the next few years. Thank you, and I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Anand. So we are now switching our focus a little bit and looking outside. The question we mentioned in the morning too, why do we teach what we teach and for whom do we teach what we teach is an issue that's always with us in schools of international studies. And over the years, of course, the Defense Department is one of the major parts, an important part of our constituency. And we have two presenters in this part of the session. The first one is Dr. Sam Eisen. His own training and past work experience actually already bridges the gap that we're talking about. He has a PhD and MA in Russian language and literature from Stanford University, and has taught Russian language and literature before coming into government service. And he is currently the director of the language flagship and director of programs at the National Security Education Program, NSAP. And this is an organization and source that we work very closely with. And before coming to this position, the last 3 years, Dr. Eisen was also at the Title VI National Resource Centers program at the Department of Education. So he has a very important and useful perspective to address some of the issues that we've touched upon already.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to have been invited to this forum. I think this is an important forum and a very important topic, so I thank the Jackson School and the Wilson Center for putting this on. I have been in government just a little too long to actually get myself in trouble by talking about funding, promising funding, or projecting funding, particularly in the constrained budget environment we find ourselves in. So what I want to talk to you about is particularly how academia can approach the funding question, because I think that, you know, the experience with Title VI, certainly I saw some lessons there in terms of just approaching and approaching government funders. There were many factors involved there, but also learning a lot through working on the language flagship, learning with programs that train DoD personnel and ROTC students. Have learned a lot about government needs and government approaches in the last 3 years also, having now been at DoD for 3 years. So I think the question that the very simple and powerful message from John F. Kennedy was, ask not what your country can do for you, ask rather what you can do for your country. And I think that message really is something to think about and internalize as you talk about the partnership between higher ed and government. I think many people in the room do this, but I really suggest that that be at the forefront of your thinking. And just a word about provost, since we're picking on provost. Every time I go, our director of NSEP and Defense Language National Security Education Office, Mike Nugent, who similarly has been at Title VI and at NSEP, every time we go to campus, we meet sometimes with the president or a chancellor, almost always with the provost, definitely always with multiple deans, and we always talk about how is your mission integrated with foreign language and area studies? How do you see your international mission? How can we work together? Because without the provosts and the deans and that recognition of mission at the higher level, this doesn't happen. So the question is, how can higher education meet needs for skills and expertise? How can we work together to develop programs with demonstrated results? How can we work to institutionalize programs so that universities are incorporating as a mission higher level language training and area studies, so that the question doesn't have to be, what Jim Goldgeier was asking, can we focus on regional studies? This should be the university mission. And the question should be, how can we maximize funding and maybe federal funding to increase student access, to increase student opportunity, to increase opportunities for students to do intensive professional and academic study abroad with good language training? How can we do that? And how can we leverage universities for their innovation and ingenuity? And we're seeing great examples of that. We have 9 university language training centers which provide flexible training for DoD personnel. And they're doing niche trainings that are just incredibly effective because they're leveraging university people who know how to do this and are enterprising and are talented. And that's something that we were actually told by Congress, make a partnership with higher education to improve your training, and we've done that. So Delenzio is not an Italian restaurant. It is the Defense Language and National Security Education Office. We were merged together. The Defense Language Office and the National Security Education Program were merged into one office with a massive mission, because we oversee policy for all of the language training for DoD and culture and FAO training and everything. So our Colonel Larson's presentation will dovetail very nicely with this and maybe give some more texture to what we're looking for. But we work on building a talent pipeline, people with regional skills, people with foreign language skills, enhancing workforce readiness, people ready to come into the government and be able to work in international missions, improving testing and assessment, language testing, particularly proficiency testing, but looking at culture testing models, culture assessment, creating surge capability, identifying people, particularly through the National Language Service Corps, which anyone with good language skills, I encourage you to join. And then you can be, in a time of national emergency, you can be called up as a federal employee and help your country. And regional alignment. This is going to be a very long process, I think. But the idea that when we get people who are trained, like the FAOs that we're training, or people who have skills before they become FAOs, how do we make sure that someone with really good Arabic ends up working on the Middle East and not fixing tanks somewhere else? So we're developing 2 databases in Delenzio. I don't do any of this. My colleagues do this. This will be on the quiz. CBRIP. This is one of our worst acronyms. Capabilities-based resource identification process. But it's great because it's a database that racks up all of the language skill needs for personnel across all of the combatant commands, all the units. So if we need someone to help with development or strategic communications in Africa with a level 2 knowledge of French or Swahili, that goes in the database. And these are the kinds of needs we have: communication with our host nation, communication with partners. If we're working with the French, we need French. If we're working in Latin America, we need Spanish, Portuguese. Understanding politics, history, culture, intentions, the intentions of other nations, strategic communications around the world, coordination of all operations, processing information that comes in other languages. And I'll tell you what we find is that the majority of these needs are at an interagency language roundtable 2 or 3, meaning limited working proficiency or high-level professional proficiency needs. So we are really looking for people who have high-level language and can demonstrate that. And that needs to be a focus within regional and area studies, because we want people who have expertise, who've been to the region, who know the region, but for specific jobs, we also want that higher level language. The other thing that we're doing, so we're identifying needs. The other thing that we're doing that I'm going to come back to at the end is something called the Regional Proficiency Assessment Tool. Now, this is a tool that goes into sort of personnel databases that we have and tries to make a formula to figure out who is a regional expert. Let's say we have, you know, an issue in Uzbekistan. So the database can go through and figure out who knows Uzbek, who has taken relevant degree programs, who's been there, you know, who has just a range of skills and abilities and experience that correspond to that. So the point being that we're trying to define, our colleagues that we work with are trying to define what is a regional expert, how do we know one when we see one, how can we find one when we need one. So I'll come back to that. I'll just talk about the NCEP initiatives. The important thing about the NCEP initiatives, and we do span the globe with Boren scholarships and fellowships, which come with service. You go overseas, you study, you learn language, and you come back and serve in the US government. The language flagship, which is based on trying to get to that professional language proficiency in critical languages. Project Global Officer, which trains ROTC students. The National Language Service Corps, which I mentioned. We have this group of programs, but what I want to stress is that we have a lot of measures to measure success. If programs aren't successful, we don't keep funding them. This is mostly Boren scholars and fellows, but also some English heritage learners and some other scholarships. This is about 20 years. In 20 years, we've placed 3,348 young people in positions in government. About a quarter of those, about 850 in DOD, close to 600 in State Department, 135 in intelligence agencies. That's not the full intel picture, because some people at other agencies are also in intel-coded billets. About another quarter throughout the federal government, Treasury, Commerce, Agriculture, all the international focused jobs, and 25% if students can't find a job if graduates can't find a job in government, they do have the option to teach in their field and fulfill their service requirement that way. So 25% have ended up teaching. So another type of result is language results. The ROTC program that we fund started really as a cultural immersion program, short stays overseas, and our office decided that we wanted to start cranking it up so that future officers would come in not only with some study abroad, but with a good base in language. So we introduced, 2 years ago, we introduced a requirement to get some basic proficiency, ILR1, which is sort of an intermediate level. We've got 71% of our students meeting that after 4 semesters now, which doesn't always happen in Arabic and Chinese, I can tell you. 8% reaching ILR1 plus and 8% reaching ILR2. We're going to launch a special initiative to try to train more officers with 2. We had 5 in Chinese and Russian who made 222, which is of which some language coded billets, that would be enough for some language coded billets. We want our FAOs to be a little bit higher, but I think if they start with 222 and we maintain, we'll be able to train them up really well. And that's, as you can see, 2,500 participants so far. We have the flagship program, which gets students up to professional proficiency in all of these languages. We have open competitions per language periodically, I would say. I expect that we'll be doing, opening up Arabic again in the fall. Those are our partners. You go to your domestic university, you get trained in your major, you can do any major. We have science majors, social science majors. The little orange newsletter on the table out there talks about, focuses on our STEM majors who are taking language. What they do is they qualify at an advanced level. We send them overseas to our overseas programs. They do professional internships. They enroll in courses at universities overseas, and they get intensive language with the goal of getting full professional proficiency. 65% of last year's crop, 67% actually made 3 or 3+, which is a fully professional level. That's the level at which we want to have our FAOs. 93% were 2+ and above, so almost everyone was pretty close to there. If you look at the Arabic listening, that didn't really, those colors didn't come out. These are pre and post scores color-coded, but you can see at the end, most of them have 2+ and 3 listening skills, 2+ and 3 reading skills. So we do teach them to read. We don't just teach them to speak. And I think the most important thing that I want to leave you with is, and I had a great conversation talking with Association for Slavic and East European and Eurasian Studies about their upcoming strategy. And this is what I kind of wanted to leave them with, but I want to leave all of you with this idea that the way for the associations and the universities to market to business, to government, to interact, I think, is to look at what are standards or characteristics for a regional expert. I don't think there's really a definition, a working definition that I know of that people come to me with. What is the language proficiency? If someone finishes your master's in international studies, what is the language proficiency that you expect them to walk out with? What experience abroad? Do they have professional experience abroad? Have they done an internship? Have they done a specific research task? Have they interacted with professionals overseas? What do they do? What is their cultural knowledge, regional expertise, disciplinary skills? And, you know, I leave it up to the political scientists and economics people to say, you know, what should an economics MA be able to do for you? But I think it's important for government and business to have that laid out so that if you're saying, I have an MA from the Jackson School or a PhD, what does that mean in my terms, to my head? What can that person do? I'd like to know what that person can do. I understand that they have a lot of, and what are the added values? And once they get in, see the added values, once they get into the organization, once they get into a business, once they get into the government agencies and they see how much more sophistication some of these people have because of their training, then they come back and say, as they do for the Born program, we'd like to order 10 more of those. But you have to do the initial convincing. Demonstrate results. Try to have a professional focus along with the academic focus. Integrate language and regional skills into core institutional mission and messaging. Most provosts and presidents want their institution to have an international mission, but you can help them define what that really means. And engage business and government. We're out here, we're looking for great people, we want great people. Hiring's tough, but you know what? The people that DoD is going to hire are going to be the ones with the great skills. Same at State Department and same across the government. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. So in my world, when we talk about trenches, we usually mean the classroom. So when you go down to the trenches, you deal with students. Our next presenter is really in the trenches. He's Colonel Eric Larson. He is now the director of the U.S. Army's Foreign Area Officer Program, and that's a program that we in the Jackson School have worked very closely with over the years, and I've had some really excellent students coming our way through that program. And Colonel Larson is also the product of area studies training. He has a graduate degree in Middle East Studies from University of South Carolina. He is going to give us a view from the trenches. In other words, what happens and how the training in language and area studies is utilized by the U.S. Army and various branches of the U.S. government through that branch when they go out with their degrees. Thank you.
So I'd like to give you some comfort that your programs are immensely important. And in fact do have a direct impact on bilateral and multilateral international issues through the graduates of your programs. I want to give a personal thanks to Dr. Shahrour Akhavi, who was willing to spend hours and hours of his time one-on-one in his office with me to unpackage Arab-Israeli peace process issues and help me work through my own misperceptions or preconceptions about what that meant and why that was important. That investment by Dr. Akhavi in me and my education and my career has translated into a frame through which I see U.S. interests and U.S. relationships with our Middle East partners and our frenemies in the Middle East. So I think it's possible that the gap between academia and policy is being overstated. So if you see that relationship as a direct meeting between a senior policy decision maker and a senior professor who's an expert, and you measure that as that relationship, you may be disappointed. You may have only the opportunities to meet for lunch once every few months with someone with whom you have a personal relationship. But that senior decision maker has a staff. And they don't write the papers. No general writes papers. So the people who write the papers are the graduates of your programs. So we write the policy papers that the senior leaders then scan and say, okay, that's acceptable, or it's not acceptable, go back and do it again. And that is where your influence is felt on a daily basis. So you may have read in the papers that the U.S. Mill Group in Ecuador has been asked to depart Ecuador. Obviously, there are very complex relationships, not just with the elected government in Ecuador, but with their Ministry of Defense. Well, Colonel Paul DeCecco is here all day today, friend of mine, graduate of San Diego, international affairs, and he's at the State Department unpackaging what does that mean for U.S. policy. So El Anbar is melting down. The Anbari sheikhs regularly call our senior FAOs complaining about U.S. policy towards the Iraqi government. Well, Colonel Jeff Wyatt, a University of Georgia grad, international affairs, well, he's at the White House today talking about what is really going on and how does that impact. So if you want to know where your impact is being felt, those are two friends of mine who are graduates of your programs who are talking today, impacting, and they are explaining what they believe to be the situation on the ground to senior decision makers here back in D.C. When Libya melted down, Colonel Brian Linville, Middle East FAO, Princeton product, he was the only senior Department of Defense official on the ground explaining what was going on with the security environment there. So you do have a very direct impact. So every strategy, I work in the Strategy Plans and Policy Directorate of the Army Staff. I'm the Strategic Leadership Division Chief. I have 4 major portfolios. They include Army fellowships, Army strategists, Army foreign area officers, and then a Department of the Army civilians who are international affairs specialists, regional specialists, and international engagement specialists and linguists. So the Department of the Army civilians that fall under a number of different career programs are also part of this division. It's about 3,000 people overall, but all of those 3,000 have links into the international affairs and foreign language community. So every strategy begins with a vision. So this is what General Odierno has told us the vision for the Army is. So, and I'd be interested in your perceptions of that, because I read that as saying that there is a significant role for international affairs and foreign language education for the Army going forward. So a globally responsive and regionally engaged Army. If we're going to provide support to security partners around the world by, with, and through those partners, we're going to need to have a level of constant engagement that is significantly more than in the past. So this is not an Army that stays back at home station and does raid, ambush, and move into contact in a local training area. So we are going over and we are working with foreign partners. So the Army's organizing principle is going to be a regionally aligned force. So every formation within the U.S. Army now we have theater campaign plans, and every formation is aligned against a theater. So we've had in the past, our security cooperation efforts, we call that Phase 0, shaping operations, helping foreign partners in those areas develop the capacity to maintain their own security. So in Africa, we've sort of provided support to them in an ad hoc manner. Well, now we have a formation that is oriented to Africa for a duration to provide security cooperation support there. So this means that we need a lot of this came out of our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the need for, even in tactical formations, a level of understanding of the local culture and language. So that decision to regionally align has led to a strategy development for language, regional expertise, and culture. And so this is a draft document, and we're trying to hash out what does this turn into in terms of requirements for how we need to, what level do different people need to be trained at. And so the Army's made a decision. For most of our conventional forces, we're going to have a basic level of language, regional expertise, and culture training. And then we're going to try to grow that capability slowly over time. It takes a lot of time to put somebody into school. Languages are very time intensive to train. For this Army Special Operations Forces, they have a slightly different level of expertise. For our linguists, we need to be fantastic. They need to be able to do simultaneous translation. We need that level of capability. But maybe they don't need to be a master of the whole region. One of the issues with a linguist, even possibly with a native trained linguist, is they may have a cultural lens that lends to one portion of a region, or of a view of a region they may come with their own misperceptions. And they don't necessarily need to know the whole region. They're there for language expertise, although many of them have fantastic broader regional expertise as well. And certainly they have great cultural expertise. But the Army is going to invest the most money in its foreign area officer programs. So they found that the time needed to train a regional, what they would term a regional expert, is so intensive that it's not possible to take a career command track officer, put him through all that training, and maintain competitiveness for command. So we have separate career fields that provide that regional expertise. And that takes us to the Army Foreign Area Officer Program. So this is one of the major portfolios I have. But once again, if we want to come back to what is the impact of your graduates in these different areas. So the last defense attaché in Syria, and currently the joint staff lead for the Levant and Syria is Colonel Rob Friedenberg, who's a Middle East Foreign Area Officer, and I believe another Princeton grad. So General Hooper, who was the defense attaché in Beijing, now in a major general, and he was regionally the chief of plans at U.S. AFRICOM. I love the picture on the left for my program and its funding, because Colonel Prue doing direct translation for General Dempsey, the visual of that is fantastic for us. It certainly makes FAOs look like they're whispering in the ear of power, which is, the visual's great. So I put that on all my slides. So we want commanders to understand how to use their foreign area officers. They want to understand what they bring in terms of regional expertise, and then we want them to be able to turn to that regional experts. So the commander is not going to develop that level of regional expertise, but he will have at hand somebody who does, and he will know how to utilize that officer best. And then for our Japan FAOs, Colonel Agena, Operation Tomodachi. So when the reactors melted down, and the coordination of the humanitarian support by the U.S. Department of Defense is being led by a regional expert who is based at the U.S. Embassy in that country. So there's currently 1,240 FAOs. We have 940 billets in the structure. So I have about 300 officers in training at any given time. I put 100 officers into graduate schools every year, 100 officers into language schools every year. Most of those go to DLI out in Monterey. Low-density languages will come to the East Coast, to DC, and we use a lot of several contract language programs there. Department of State supports us, obviously, in many of those languages as well. And then we do in-region training. So all these officers will do 12 months based out of an embassy with a travel budget, and their job is to travel all over the region, write papers, and get an understanding for security cooperation. What are U.S. interests? How does an embassy run? How does the ambassador develop his integrated country strategy? What's the DoD support to that integrated country strategy? How do we support the ambassador's vision for that relationship? So that's their internship. And then they come, so the pipeline is language, then 12 months of regional training, then their graduate degree. And then, so they'll come to the graduate program having come just out of the region with extensive travel all over the region. And then we'll put them into the assignments. Generally, we try to put people in embassy-based assignments as junior officers, and then they will come back over time into more senior positions. So there is an Army colonel, Colonel Tony Pfaff, we just put him in the Department of State and the policy planning shop, and he's, helping to develop the DoD support to Department of State policy planning, and he gets to brief, Secretary Kerry, and brief his papers to Secretary Kerry. He's a Georgetown PhD, so that's sort of what we get at the top end of all that education. We'll give them as much as we can over time, and that's what we get at the top. And that is the end of my presentation. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. So these have been very nice 3 papers. They complement presentations. They complement each other very well. With Anand, we got a sense of the tremendous impact the various programs that originate from the U.S. government has at the University of Washington, a university like the University of Washington. And with Sam, we got a perspective from several of the agencies that have been funding some of these programs, and there, of course, an issue of communication is how can we do a better job of presenting what we do to our supporters outside the academia. In meetings and conferences that I go to that are focused on area studies, it is always, we always talk to each other, and we all agree that what we do is very important and very valuable. And then, and we always talk about these others who don't get it, who don't understand, cut our budgets and do all those terrible things to us. So when we get out of our comfort zone, I think it's really instructive and helpful to think about what is it that we can do. And with Colonel Larson's presentation, it's very pleasing to see something that works very well. And I also had really valuable experiences with some of my FAO students who called me from their posts for recommendations for reading because they were about to brief their their commanders next day about an issue. That's just wonderful. But there too, that knowledge always doesn't always come back to us to know what works and what is it that we can do better so that it works better. So all of this, I think, creates a very nice sort of three presentations and a beginning for various questions and discussions. So I'm just going to turn it over to you for your questions, and then we'll hopefully get them. Yes.
There he goes. Carlos Indacochea from the George Washington University. In listening to the issue of funding of Title IX and governmental funding for language proficiency, I wonder if there's an issue of cultural and political basis for that kind of use of public funds. The United States is a country that resists foreign languages, and I think Spanish is a prime example. We have 10% of the population whose language is Spanish, and yet, even when we think of bilingual, that is, bilingual approaches to teaching Hispanic kids, the goal is to turn them into monolingual. so that we do not use properly the wide variety of immigrants we have in languages from all over the world as a basis for language expertise, except, of course, us as an exception.
Okay. Sam, did you want to?
Well, we certainly encounter resistance to foreign language education at many levels, and we work to overcome that. I think I'll just say there are some bright spots. We have an initiative working at the K-12 level that's sponsored out of Brigham Young University in the state Department of Education of Utah. We have partners across 20 states in the flagship Chinese acquisition pipeline who are all cooperating to develop Chinese dual immersion programs for younger students in some Chinese language high school programs. And these have community support. People understand, it's very interesting, they really do understand that dealing with China is going to be important. There are different political issues, with Spanish education in the country. But I think there are some bright spots, and the best we can do is to support the people and communities who are willing to make some progress.
Is one of our success stories actually a UW alum?
I don't need a microphone. For Colonel Larson, talking about the FAO programs and the successes that I think everybody's pretty excited to hear that these sort of degrees are relevant to the field in the Army and the military in general right now. How do you incentivize programs like this for incoming officers with a shrinking budget to improve what we have as a global fighting force that is ready and adaptable, considering smaller budgets, smaller ranks in both enlisted and officer fields that would normally project towards more conventional forces like infantry and artillery branches because of career progression?
So it's if we look at trying to give this level of training for regional expertise and language to the other parts of the general purpose force, it rapidly becomes prohibitive. So trying to align a career track, a region, language, it's very, very difficult. I think we will probably see stable funding for specific career paths. I do not believe, based on the chief's vision, General Odierno's vision, I think he will protect the current FAO program in its current. So where I have lost some money is in graduate school funding over the last 2 years. So and there are programs here represented by professors here where we lost a lot of our 18-month programs. I cannot produce enough language and regional. I can't produce enough FAOs to meet the demand. So I'm only filling my billets at, we have way too many people in the Army. We're having to shrink down, and I can still only fill my billets at 83%. I can't produce enough Middle East experts and Africanists and Middle East officers to meet the demand. I think my funding will remain stable, and the combatant commands are the customer for this. So they come to us and they say, I don't want an officer with a pure sort of tactical experience. I want somebody who has lived and worked in this region, who knows how to work with these partners. That's what's most critical to me. And so I think those are stable. There are officers who come into the Army with the sole purpose of really eventually coming to FAO. So they're young officers who they come right in with speaking Russian or speaking Arabic. They've already got an undergraduate degree, so they're very easy to train. They're highly motivated, and I pull them in at the first opportunity.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Hi, my name is Angela Woods, and I'm at the Department of State in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, and I manage a program called the Critical Language Scholarship Program. And my question is directed to Dr. Eisen, related to the two databases that you mentioned. The first one, in regards to the database identifying language needs, I was curious as to what are some of the new critical languages that you see that are coming out and that we should be paying some attention to, and also related to the other database in terms of identifying people who have the background, kind of language and regional expertise. Is that a database that you're using internally for participants who've gone through your programs, or are you connecting with other agencies in their programs, or even maybe some of the graduate programs who have students who have those backgrounds?
Thanks for that question, and thank you for your critical language scholarships. We have a lot of cross-pollination on flagship and ROTC students going on these programs and really benefiting, so I'm a big fan of CLS. I should clarify that I probably can't say a lot about the capabilities-based requirements CBRIP database, but it's a database specifically for DoD personnel, so it's only DoD personnel. We do not track students in that way, nor do we track students with the Regional Proficiency Assessment Tool. These are all internal DoD, Department of Defense personnel systems. So we wouldn't use that for students. What we do for students is for those who get Boren Fellowships or scholarships and have government service, we will disseminate their skills widely among government agencies on a, it's a voluntary basis because they've decided to do this, and we will try to help match Borens with interested employers. So I think the Boren scholarships and fellowships are the best way to find these jobs. And I didn't show the slide that showed all the different pieces of Department of Defense that use these scholars, that hire these scholars and fellows. But U.S. Army is a big consumer. Some of the folks who the Defense Intelligence Agency is looking for these people. But the more that we send them out, the more people want them, and the same is true at State Department and the fellows. We have the diplomatic fellow relationship so that they can skip the written exam.
Check 1 2. Hey. Check 1 2. Check 1 2.
Thank you. Rick Lotzbeich, Indiana State University. And my question is for Colonel Larson, but the other panelists may comment as well. What I heard you talking about mostly was graduate level education. I'm interested in undergraduate education and trying to get lessons here for how to further develop a minor we have in international studies, which includes language studies, study abroad, and so
Check
forth.
1 2.
Do you
Check
have any
1.
particular suggestions for
Check 1
pursuing
2.
these programs at the undergraduate level? It was very interesting to see how this training feeds into direct application within the military, so I thank you for your presentation. An element of that is, should I approach the ROTC on campus to engage them in this program? Is that a useful direction to go? So undergraduate education generally and ROTC in particular.
So yes, you should please talk to the ROTC department and tell all the cadets that we would like them to all learn a foreign language, and I prefer a Cat 3 or a Cat 4 language. I can find, we have so many Americans who have fantastic Spanish capability. You know, I can find a 5.5 in Castilian Spanish, you know, who, you know, easily. Even a baseline in language coming into the services of VAT is very, very useful. So even if they're only to a 1-1 level coming onto active duty, that's still very useful. You know, we aim for a 2-2 or higher, but the advantage of a 1-1 is that I have separate funding mechanisms to do language sustainment than we do to have language acquisition. Language acquisition is exceptionally expensive and generally requires residential programs. Language sustainment is a lot more flexible. If people have a baseline in language, I can find funding mechanisms to put them into a summer program for a month. Delencio supported, I mean, they supported us, you know, to the tune of $900,000 last year for language sustainment, and we put people in a lot of different sustainment programs. So that's very useful. And then for the academic courses, so history, sociology, geography, you know, they need to have an understanding of what shapes contemporary politics, and you know, who are, you know,
Check 1, 2.
how are decisions made in that country or within that region, and who influences those decisions? Because simply looking at the governmental structures won't necessarily tell you who is really making the decisions.
They're also eligible for Project Go. Project Go, they can apply and get
Check
a
1,
summer
2.
run.
Check 1, 2.
Talking about Project Go, I
Check
teach at
1,
Howard
2.
University. It's a historically black read. Diversify the officer stream. We pull actually students from across DC that don't have ROTC, like Catholic and a couple of the other schools. However, I teach Russian, so I get the occasional ROTC, and I cannot sell Project Go to them to save my life. Seriously. Like this year, I have Quentin, who is bright, good, doing well, and I just couldn't sell Project Go to him. And I'm sitting there going, oh, dude, right? So there you go. How do we sell Project Go to the ROTCs that are just strategically thinking a great way to start diversifying also the command pool? There you go.
So an officer who works for me was an Army attaché in Moscow, and is a site of the Marshall Center, and so but he's very good at getting people enthusiastic about Eurasian studies. You know, the Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, the politics there are so complex. I think I'll get contact from you. Actually, one of the things I get in trouble for within the larger Army is that there's everyone is trying to recruit highly talented minority officers, and highly talented minority officers who have an interest in international studies and may have had they may be a native speaker, that many of them gravitate to the FAO program. And so generally what happens on the selection boards is they tell me I can't have any more because I've basically stripped out the other branches of their top talent. So everybody's fighting over the same pool of people.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist and vice president of an NGO. The question is to the Colonel. I've worked in the former Soviet Union and worked with U.S. embassies, and I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how the FAOs interact with the other embassy people in addition to the ambassador. Embassies are complicated places. There's a lot of knowledge there. There are sometimes stovepipes. And it seems to me the FAOs have a lot to share. Not everybody understands the U.S. military, and not everybody in the embassy does. So tell us a little, if you would, about the interaction of FAOs and the embassy when they're overseas.
So actually, we treat Department of State and embassies as a subculture. So when we're talking about cultural studies, we talk about the microcosm of the embassy and the interagency relationships that are there, because we are products of our individual cultures. I'm an infantry and special forces officer. I come from a sort of a very specific line. I react to different, stimuluses in different ways, and a foreign service officer does not. And so part of what FAOs do is translate between the Department of State and the Department of Defense. And so when a general and an ambassador are in the room and they're talking past each other because they come from those two different cultures, the FAO is the person who can understand both sides. So that's a very specific role for us in the embassy. But every Army officer in the U.S. Embassy in Russia, all those senior Army officers are all FAOs. So the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the officers who are there, the officers training and doctrine command liaisons, the Army attachés, the security cooperation officers. Those are all foreign area officers. Most of those officers would have done a stateside master's degree, and then they would have done a program at 12 to 18 months at the Marshall Center in Garmisch and done their regional travel out of there. We're trying to push them a little bit more into embassies, but there just aren't that many. I mean, it's hard to put too many trainees in embassies.
Yes.
My name is Vincent Wang. I'm a professor of political science and associate dean at the University of Richmond. So my question about funding and resources may have reflected both perspectives. So there's no doubt Title VI is important, and on campus we often hear about the debate between our types and the STEM type. And I'm very glad to hear that Title VI is even Fulbright is supporting the STEM faculty. Have we thought about preaching to the unusual suspects, namely National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, or Center for Disease Control? It's almost a cliche to say that science is international, but why can they help pay some of our bills?
Anand, did you want to comment?
Actually, Title VI, one of the expanded mission of Title VI was to reach out to those parts of campus that benefit precisely from the three agencies you mentioned. So for instance, we work fairly closely with global health. We work very closely with public health. We work with social work. So we do interact with groups that receive funding from it. But as you know, these agencies have actually cut back. Their funding has been cut back. And if you ask anybody in STEM, the standard story is the points you have to receive in order to get funding now. That once upon a time, 97 or 98 would guarantee funding, and it no longer does. So they're facing the same situation. And if you will recall, since it affected political science and social sciences specifically, NSF had a huge debate about whether or not to continue funding social science. So there isn't a lot of room for optimism that these agencies whose funding has declined is likely to take on an additional area, even though the funding that would be needed is so minuscule. I think that's precisely one of the questions, that because it's such a tiny fraction of even the U.S. Department of Education funding, that doing away with it or paring it down is not a difficult decision to make. And at an embassy party here a few years ago, I went up to this very tall man who was standing all by himself, and I said, "Secretary Duncan, what have you done to Title VI?" And his response was, "Well, what would you do if you were in my shoes? If the choice was between K through 12 education and Title VI." He says, "That was the choice I was faced with." And we all
Check
know
1,
that
2. Hey.
the department is focused heavily on K through 12 education.
Check 1, 2.
Let me just add that I encourage you to take the newsletter, which focuses on foreign language and STEM and the international nature of STEM. We have some very good voices and partners. We have a high-level administrator at NASA who is a Boren Fellow who talks about the international nature of all space cooperation, aeronautics cooperation, energy. We're placing fellows at CDC constantly. So I think there are inroads to be made. There are also forward-looking science deans. There's the International Engineering Program at University of Rhode Island that we partner with to create engineers with Chinese who can work directly in manufacturing across partnerships. So I think there's a lot that can be done in cultivating these relationships, and I think it's very important as you look at the enterprise of applied science right now, and we have students in biolabs in Russia and China doing work with colleagues, but I think it is an uphill battle, but I do think there are science deans out there who get it and cultivate them.
Yes, so we have just about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to follow Lara's lead and take 3 questions and then ask the panelists, and then Lara has a question too. So if you can keep your hands up so that they'll know to pass the microphones to
So
you.
I'm still ruminating on Anand's first question of why so little money for something that has so transformed the field of international studies. And I wonder to what extent, it relates to this broader issue of America's interest in isolating itself again and kind of disengaging from international affairs. And I guess what I wonder is lacking maybe at a more national level conversation about the need for American expertise in foreign language and foreign area studies. And I wonder if the panel could maybe address that issue.
So there are 2 more questions, if you could, Sam and
I'm Catherine O'Neill. I teach Russian at the Naval Academy, and I just have a question, probably mostly for Colonel Larson. We are trying to train our midshipmen to gain the proficiency at preferably a 2 level or above, and we cannot do that without immersion programs and study abroad. And I was just wondering how this can be addressed. This is at the moment only concerns the Russian students, but I can imagine it would also affect other languages as well. Obviously, the Arabic program has been affected according to events in Egypt, et cetera, was able to salvage the program in other places. So far China has been okay, but who knows how that will go. So I was just wondering if you have any ideas of how we can sustain these programs and this obvious need for our future officers that will then be graduating with exactly the proficiency you need to place as even linguists. Thank you.
So there's one more. Let's take that question. Oh, 2. Very quickly, please. Yes.
My name's Thomas Grindley. I noticed that there are a number of foreign sources of funding of language studies. What percentage is this of the total funding? Which countries are most and least interested in providing this funding? And how useful is the language knowledge resulting from it?
Okay, that's the last one. Let's take that one too, and then, yeah.
Okay, my name is Beverly Home-Fincher, and I'd like to thank the UW who provided me my first academic job. I was a linguist. I was hired because the reason why I got my job was because my first paper was on Navajo.
I'm happy to take credit, so.
So thank you very much, University of Washington. But anyway, and I have bad news to tell you that, even though I benefited from Title VI, but then someone spoke about provost, not just someone. Many people spoke about the provost. Provosts do wield tremendous power, maybe greater than Mao and others. After my retirement, I worked at the University of District of Columbia. Now, UDC, unlike Howard University, who have very good administrators, but then UDC do have good students. I was able to send one student with a scholarship to Stanford University, another student to University of Chicago, and yet I wrote 2 proposals, one to one to the Education Department, another one to the Confucius Institute. Both, one was neglected, they lost their papers. Another one, due to political considerations, they did not want to establish Confucius Institute on campus, even though it had been approved by the many layers of administration. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask the panelists to briefly respond or comment so that we'll go to lunch. Anna, do you want to start?
Very, very quickly. And they're sort of, these are answers to the questions that have been raised, but also responding to earlier questions that were raised. So if you look at MLA's annual compilation of number of language takers in different languages, as we all know from our campuses, for those of you who are academics, the decline has been great in German and French and such languages. Spanish has continued to rise, but a number of lictals have become among the top 10 languages, or risen in huge numbers: Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Arabic, so on and so forth. But overall, the percentage of students taking foreign languages today, percentage-wise of number of students on campus, has declined considerably from the 1950s and 60s. So percentage decline over sheer numbers increase, except declining numbers in certain European languages. So that's one of the issues. The second is foreign support for foreign language instruction. Very few actually support their language instruction. The one exception, although there are certain European funding agencies that have provided funding, the one new sort of player in that is, of course, the Confucius Institute. And if you've been following the saga of Confucius Institutes around the country, they've come under a lot of attack. Some of it is warranted. I know at certain universities, if I take my own as an example, it has not necessarily benefited the university very much. It's benefited K through 12, but not the university. The third is the general sort of climate for language support, and I'm bringing the provost back in here, at the highest levels of university administration has declined considerably, from presidents at major public universities openly saying, why do we still have departments of French and Spanish and German and so forth, to schools of international affairs, and one in particular, which I shall not name, saying, if you need foreign language knowledge of language X, Rosetta Stone will do just as well as taking courses. So let me stop there.
Sam, do you want to say?
Sure. For the service academies, Delencia is looking at different ways that we can partner with service academies. We're trying to think up some new strategies, so we'll certainly work with you on that. The question of study abroad for in Russia and in the Middle East is, of course, always is becoming more challenging. We relocated our Arabic flagship to Morocco in the light of events in Egypt, and before that Syria. You know, the Russians have now indicated their unwillingness to host U.S. service personnel for language training as part of the counter sanctions. So it's definitely a challenge, and would like to work with you on that. I mean, in terms of U.S., whether we're isolating or whether that's the tendency, I think the thing to do is make it clear what the tie is between foreign language looking out needing to be global in terms of business, in terms of our ability to operate in the world, in terms of our ability to make a product. One of the best sessions I went to was a process we did, the Rhode Island Language Roadmap, where we brought state and education people together to talk about language in Rhode Island. This works much better in small states than it does in California. We did it in Hawaii too, much better. But, because the governor comes, you know. But, I mean, we have to make this clear. I think if we make it clear to parents, we will generate demand. I think the ACTFul campaign, the American Council of Teachers of Foreign Language that's coming, leading with language. What can you do with language? How does that help you become a leader? How does that help you become successful? I think that's maybe the level we need to start with.
I'm not sure the U.S. government is actually withdrawing. So we have large numbers of combat forces that were forward deployed for very specific purposes that are coming home. But in fact, DoD structures in embassies is increasing. So, you know, if an embassy previously only had, you know, 1 or 2 personnel and it now has 4 or 5, you know, that's a 150% increase. You know, that's pretty substantial. When we look globally across all the embassies, I've increased embassy-based positions by 25%, you know, over the last 2-3 years, with the wars drawing down. So, and that's true for the other services too. So actually, our forward footprint, at least our daily engagement with foreign partners, is increasing, and all of those people need international affairs experience. And yeah. So yeah, I won't speak to the American public. Americans can decide what they want to do, and I'll go where they tell me to go. Where they tell me to go. So happy to do it. Specifically to the programs that we're using and that Delencia is supporting, I can talk to you about those individually.
This has been a very instructive and interestingly inspiring session. I want to thank the panelists and thank you for your participation and questions. And we will. The plan is now to go to lunch, and we will reconvene.
Did he really?
Yeah. Instead, he's going to do cybersecurity.
Okay, he's making the transition from FAO to cyber.
Well, he's moving to Okinawa.
Okay, so we have, the officers we have that are sliding to cyber, they've asked for a FAO, but it's mostly my strategists. So the guys who, they have